Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We're bringing you another episode in our cloud security series. And the reason for the series is really to bring awareness to what can be protected when you're using cloud services, as well as developing and hosting applications in the cloud. And it is around a lot of the CNAPP capabilities within Azure and the Defender services from Microsoft, which a lot of them are actually unique to the platforms, things that other cloud service providers do not have. But the concepts can be applied to wherever you're hosting your applications or your infrastructure. So the goal is really to make sure that you're defending your cloud infrastructure as best as possible.
And of course, Andy and I do both work for Microsoft in our security sales business in the field. Microsoft does not have any editorial control over the show. We don't do the show during work. So as I've come to summarize it simply, we do this show on our own time and on our own dime. But certainly we talk a lot about Microsoft because it's what we're most familiar with. And we thought we can share that knowledge with the world. So Andy, let's talk about Defender for App Service.
Yeah, so Defender for App Service, a really easy and simple one to turn on. Again, with a lot of these Defender workload ones within Azure, part of the Defender for Cloud, there's just a toggle. It has to be tied to a subscription. And so if you are using Azure App Services, Defender for App Services is really an easy one to just flip on and identify a lot of the attacks that are targeting your applications. The supported plans, pretty much anything within the app service subscription, if you're using the free plan, basic service plan, standard service plan, the premium ones, and the app service environments version 1 and 2. When you enable it, you immediately get some benefits. For example, you get Defender for App Service to assess your resources that are covered by Azure App Services plan, and it generates security recommendations based on those findings. And you can use those recommendations to harden up your app service environment with a lot of the instructions that are along with the recommendations. It also helps you detect a multitude of different threats. For example, the VM instance in which your app service is running and its management interface, the requests and responses sent to and from your app service apps, the underlying sandboxes and VMs, and then app service internal logs, which are available thanks to the visibility that Azure has as a cloud provider. So really, this is a simple one. If you're using Azure App Service, which is something that is unique to Microsoft, it's unique to Azure. If you're using that as a development platform, just go ahead and turn it on, because you're going to get security recommendations on how to harden that environment, as well as any threats to that service that will show up in your Defender for Cloud alert portal, which can be tied to, if you're using a SIEM, it can be exported to a SIEM or Sentinel or the new unified SOC experience within the Microsoft security portal.
Yeah, as always, when we talk about these, some of the major benefits are you turn this on per workload, per subscription. And so for security teams, what I like about this is it gives you the confidence that as other teams are building services in Azure, you can know they are protected from birth. The moment a new resource is spun up, a new app service instance, for example, is spun up, they don't even have to come to you and ask, hey, what should we do? Because it's just going to be protected the moment it's created. And then if it's configured in an insecure manner, you're going to get alerts in multiple places helping you understand how to configure it in the proper manner. You get effectively security posture management for app service as part of enabling the service. It will help coach you on configuration that could be done in a more hardened way. And then, of course, all the anomaly detection and alerting and visibility that you get from the service as well. So again, I think a no-brainer to turn this on. And on a previous show several weeks ago now, I talked about how organizations tend to get a little tunnel visioned and basically have this attitude that as long as I have endpoint protection on my endpoints, servers, and clients, I'm protected. And that is overly simplifying the problem. You need defense in depth. This operates at a service level. It has a different level of visibility without impacting any development. You don't need to write the application to be aware that this exists, and there's no performance degradation from enabling it. So I always think enabling is a no-brainer. And then the costs are you get charged for what you use. So it's a consumption-based model. You'll get bills as you use app service and as you defend app service. The more app services you have, the more you get charged. But it's a very fair model because you don't pay until it's actively being consumed. So you don't have to buy a bunch of licenses up front and sit on them for 3 months while you and your PM argue over a deployment plan. And then you have to wait for a change window to get it deployed. You don't pay till this gets turned on. Which reduces that gap between buying licenses and using a license. Instead, there's no gap. You're not paying until you're using it. So I really like the deployment model, like the simplicity of deployment, and like the assurance this gives security teams that as resources are deployed in cloud, they're protected automatically.
Another one that is an easy one to turn on and a little bit more along the lines of data is Defender for databases. And this one is if you are using Azure SQL databases or SQL servers on machines or open source relational databases or Azure Cosmos DB. And so a lot of people use SQL databases. And so if you're using them even on-prem or hosted in Azure, or if in this case, this particular one will work on AWS databases and GCP databases, because for SQL, we can actually onboard those to Arc. So Azure Arc is a way to onboard on-premise, AWS, basically anything that's not hosted within Azure, get visibility in Azure. And once you do that, in this case, you can turn on Defender for databases for those Arc-enabled resources, as well as anything that's enabled on Azure as part of your subscription if you're hosting those databases within Azure. So what do you get with it? Well, first and foremost, again, with a lot of these cloud security solutions, you get vulnerability assessment and posture management. So you're definitely going to get assessment scans of all of your SQL databases in your machines, their security state, and any details of those security findings. Things like permission configurations or feature configurations or database settings that might be insecure, you're going to get recommendations on those and how to mitigate and change those so that you're going to be in a more secure state. And then as part of this, also, you get some advanced threat protection. So you get a service that will continually monitor your SQL servers for threats like potential SQL injection attacks, brute force attacks, privilege abuse. You'll get alerts on anonymous database access and query patterns or suspicious database activity. And this is one of the multiple vectors that attackers are using because you host your data within SQL databases. And SQL injection is still a very popular attack that can easily be executed by anyone. It's been around for a long time. And if you're susceptible to it, Defender for Database will help you detect those attacks and help you mitigate that.
So this is a little different than a lot of the other defenders we've talked about with the native protection of cloud resources, where it runs in kind of that substrate of the service. And the difference here is that there is Defender for SQL Server on machines. That's really the key differentiator here. So yes, it does run in the background in that service substrate level for resources hosted on Azure. So Azure SQL databases, Azure Cosmos DB, open source relational databases hosted on Azure. Those can all be protected at that service level. And Andy talked about this, but I'll just reiterate the point. Let's say you are running in IaaS, and maybe not even in Azure, but on a third-party cloud like AWS or GCP, or still on premises. You have VMs that are running a SQL Server application, but in an IaaS sense, not in a PaaS sense, like some of those other solutions. There's protection for them too. And it's that solution, Defender for SQL Server for machines, on machines, and all ties into the same service, all build through the same model. But again, it extends beyond the borders of Azure. So that is a unique differentiator here compared to some of the others where it's basically flip a switch and it's just on. You may have to do some work there to get that deployed. Although if they're running, again, in Azure, then it is no effort required. It'll deploy automatically. Now, regardless of how you're protecting it, you get the same benefits. And Andy walked through them. But I want to reiterate a couple of points here. Number one, defense in depth. We talk about defense in depth all the time on this show. But I just got done saying, hey, with app service, like don't just think your endpoint protection is going to protect you. That same story is true here. You should run endpoint protection on any IaaS that's also running a SQL database. However, it's not going to help you with things like SQL injection attacks or anomalous database activity or suspicious database activity. It's not going to flag that. That's not what it's there for. And it's certainly not going to give you recommendations on, hey, the way your tables are configured is suboptimal. You should make these changes to harden your environment. That's, again, not what it's for. And if you're saying, well, I have a WAF, I have a web application firewall, and it's going to strip out any attempted SQL injection, that's great. But again, defense in depth, SQL injection attacks are some of the most insidious attacks that can happen to your organization. And do you want to have a single layer of defense or do you want multiple layers of defense? You should absolutely have a WAF, and your WAF absolutely should try to block those attacks. But what if they get through? What if they're clever or novel or zero day? Don't you want a separate layer of protection that might also pick up and prevent those that's running at the service level, at the PaaS level? Yes, you do. I'll answer that question for you. You do. And that's what this does. So again, as you think through your security strategy, defense in depth, building those layered defense approaches, putting resource and workload specific protections in place. This gives that to you. And for everything that's run in Azure, again, turn it on at a subscription level and you have automatic protection. And then if you want to extend that same protection and get that single pane of glass for all of those databases, regardless of where they live, AWS, GCP, on-prem, then you can do that as well. So really two great solutions here to help protect some of your cloud workloads. And again, encouraging security teams to think beyond endpoint protection because that alone is insufficient for these needs and beyond things like WAF and firewalls. When we build a true defense in depth, we protected every layer. And we don't just assume that other layers are going to protect these layers. And that's where cloud native application protection platforms come in because they bring that protection bespoke to that workload and at that workload level. And that is something all organizations need to do. And most of these solutions are very modest in cost, very high value in terms of return on your investment, what you get for your money, and very, very easy to deploy. You don't need a project manager. You don't need a 9-month project to deploy these. You go flip a switch in the UI and it turns on. And it happens in the background and there's no impact to performance. No changes need to be made from an app dev perspective. It just works. And that's really awesome as well. So these, from a security team perspective, I run out of reasons not to do it other than cost. And again, in terms of return on your defense dollars, these are about some of the best dollars you can spend. So highly recommend taking a look at and enabling these services. And if you're not running in Azure and you're in other clouds, many of them have comparable technologies, and you should look at those as well.
Yeah, and as you were talking through that, Adam, I was thinking about where I've encountered SQL databases because I typically do not develop applications, so I don't really deal with them most of the time. However, I was thinking about two instances that are very common in organizations that use SQL databases. Number one is Entra Connect. Entra Connect is the application that syncs your identities from on-prem to M365 in the cloud, Entra. Mm-hmm. That uses SQL databases to store that data. And by default, when you install Enter Connect, SQL Server Express Local DB, which is like the light version of SQL, is installed locally. But a lot of times in large organizations, that is not enough because SQL Server Express has a limit on how many objects can be synced with that. And so if you have more than 100,000 objects, you actually need to spin up a full version of SQL. And so, that requires configuration and everything that we're talking about here as far as the vulnerability assessments. I don't know if I'd go as far, especially if you're using the SQL Server Express, I don't know if I would want to onboard it to Arc and onboard it to Defender for databases. But if I am using the full version of SQL, I think that would be something that I would do. With some caveats, obviously there's some risk involved because your Enter Connect server is considered a tier 0 resource. It's treated with the same security, or should be, as a domain controller. So, take that into consideration on what you would onboard into the cloud and how you configure those permissions. But if it is the full database, I would like to have something monitoring that. Another very common application that uses SQL database is SCCM, or now called Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager. And that also uses a full version of SQL database, which you have to stand up and configure. And oftentimes the people who are managing it don't know about the underlying database, and it's been configured before and no one's really monitored since it's been up and running. And so it might have misconfigured permissions, user identities, and you're not really monitoring it for any type of malicious activity. And so that might be something from a security standpoint you might want to look at as well. I think I would be much more in favor of onboarding an SCCM server, especially one that's on-prem, to Defender for databases, onboarding that with Arc and seeing that in the cloud, than I would Enter Connect. But it just depends on your risk appetite at your company and how you want to treat it. But those are two very common services or applications that organizations probably have in their company, and they both use SQL databases. All right, well, that is our show for this week. A short and quick one for you on these two cloud security components that you should think about. And hopefully that will help you shape how you're going to practice and get into this defense in depth, just beyond just endpoint security. Thanks for watching, as always, and listening. If you're on the audio podcast, our contact information will be in the show notes, as along with the notes that we used, the links to the documentation for these services. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, please reach out and contact us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.